Good afternoon and welcome to the CIBSE Certification webinar, ESOS and ISO 50001 Go Head to Head. This is Andrew Geens speaking at the moment, but we do have two presenters, so we'll do the introduction shortly. The presentation will take place for approximately 30 to 45 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity to have your questions answered. Throughout the presentation, please submit your questions via the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll try and get through as many as possible in the time allowed. There will also be a short survey to collect feedback once the webinar has finished, so if you have any other comments or questions, please use this to submit them, and a member of the CIBSE Certification team will get back to you. We hope you enjoy the webinar. So the aim today is to provide balanced information to help you make ESOS compliance decisions. I've seen a few webinars with this sort of theme, but they tend to favour one or the other, it seems to me. So the aim today is to try and provide a balanced view to help people make decisions in this area. So that just gives us a map of where we're going today. So let's start with me. A quick introduction. Andrew Geens, Head of CIBSE Certification. As Head of CIBSE Certification, I said we're going to offer a balanced view, but I am biased in that I set up the largest and most active ESOS register. More reports were submitted by CIBSE Certification lead assessors than any other by some margin. However, I also achieved UCAS accreditation for ISO 50001 for CIBSE Certification. I'm on the UK Mirror Group for 50001, a lead auditor and main decision maker. So if you can be biased towards both, that probably sums me up. But to further balance it, we have two presenters today to further ensure balance. So let me hand over to John to introduce himself.
Hello, good afternoon. And my name is John Field. I'm Director of Noveus Energy. I'm an ESOS lead assessor and an ISO 50001 implementation consultant. As service providers, consultants for both ESOS and ISO routes, we have extensive experience of their implementation, but also of the difficulty of providing guidance on how to choose the best approach. So the first question is, what's all the fuss about with ISO 50001?
Okay, thanks, John. If all goes well with our double act today, we may pitch for the Ant and Deck gig. Talking of decks, perhaps you'd like to start with ESOS Compliance.
Well, as I said, the webinar concerns the two main routes for compliance. And it's compliance with ESOS that we're talking about. The routes are the site and group energy audits. There's the standard ESOS route, which we all know and love. And the second route, or the other route, is the energy management system certified to ISO 50001, which many of us know and love as well. These two routes can be combined. And so we look at that too. There are two other routes which are less used and are not considered further here. They are display energy certificates and Green Deal reports. And at that point, I'm going to hand back to Andrew.
Thanks, John. Yeah, it's just important to note that if you are using that combined option, you will need to use a lead assessor for reporting. The only situation where you don't is if you're 100% using 50001. So why is it worth considering the ISO 50001 route? Well, the standard audit route is often taken by default, but many larger and more energy engaged organisations would benefit from the ISO route, but haven't really addressed the choice seriously because the standard audit route has been in front of them. Many smaller organisations would benefit from clear guidance as to whether the ISO route would be appropriate for them. There isn't much published guidance on how an organisation should go about making the decision, choosing which route suits them best. There is some guidance in the Environment Agency's ESOS guidance in section 5, but it really is a starter for 10. So hopefully today we can provide further guidance.
Time is running out for orderly and efficient compliance with either route, and especially the ISO. Historically, many organisations reject the ISO route or do not know about the issues for the decision. And so what's the sudden interest in the ISO route? Well, this is a very graphic demonstration. That interest is increasing in a classic exponential, roughly doubling every 2 years over the period of this chart, and indicating a very strong level of interest.
Yes, perhaps I should just explain the chart only goes up to 2016 because the International Standardization Organization who publish these figures collect them from cert bodies, obviously in arrears. It's normally around September before they're published, so it will be September this year before we see 2017 figures. It is interesting to look at this though. It does look very like the ISO 14001 statistics when you look at when that was first introduced 12 years before 50001 came along, so 1999. We had this same sort of hockey stick curve exponential growth, and 14001 is now up to nearly 17,000 certificates a year. So with nearly 3,000 issued in 2016, which was probably not an ESOS effect, the timing's not right. It's going to be interesting to see what 2017 is, but if it continues to grow at this rate, by the time we get to 2023 ESOS compliance, we'll find that most organisations are not pondering the question we're pondering today because they already have a 50,001 certificate on the wall. But that isn't where we are today, so that's a bit of crystal ball gazing. Let's just have a look at some reasons why 3,000 certificates are known to be out there. I should also point out that 3,000 certificates doesn't mean 3,000 organisations having 50,001 certification. A lot of large organisations will have certificates for different sites, so it's 3,000 certificates, not 3,000 organisations. So why have they gone down that route? Well, it's a globally recognised standard. Certification demonstrates the strongest commitment to energy performance improvement to both internal and external business stakeholders. It's also an opportunity to embed continual improvement. Businesses want a system that will embed continual improvement, ensuring energy saving opportunities are not just identified, but acted upon. There are some concerns that the weakness of the ESOS regulations is that providing companies with the information isn't the same as getting them acted upon. Of course, if the case is compelling enough, companies will act, but a management system is simply a way of making sure stuff happens and people remain focused. Best practice compliance, it does provide best practice. The route to producing these standards is long and tortuous because so many people are consulted and so much expertise is brought to bear. It makes it a very big international committee arrangement, but we do end up with published best practice. It helps identify and comply with all legal and other requirements related to energy use, and hence reducing the risk of non-compliance from the corporate through to site-specific level. Contractual and bid requirements are also a factor, and I think this is actually quite a strong factor in the snowballing, the sort of exponential growth. ISO 50001 is fast becoming a key component of contractual and franchise requirements, recognised as a key driver for improving tender and bid applications. Once an organisation is 50001 certified, they will often then put that requirement on their supply chain, hence the snowballing. Businesses are implementing 50001 either in response to these current requirements or in anticipation of future requirements. So, John, let's have a look at the
So we're looking at the compliance obligations and the benefits of the two approaches. I'd like to keep the obligations and the costs and the benefits separate in a way. And on that basis, it's fair to say that the ISO approach does have relative benefits. We've gone into the reasons for those already. But first, let's have a look at the compliance routes in a bit more detail, starting with the ISO. So these are the steps that we probably all are pretty familiar with. Maybe not all of us, but I suspect that a lot of people will know this. So you've got to establish ownership structure and who is participating. For single sites, this is often trivial, but as I might mention later, this is an area that has proved trickiest for groups, especially groups with changing ownership. And it's not, for some organizations, it's not a trivial step. You've got to assess the energy consumption of all uses, and that allows you to identify at least 90% of this, and it's only that 90% which is subject to audit. The other 10% being the famous de minimis, which you don't have to audit, but you still have to report its use. You've got to take a step which is to agree which sites or transport processes will be audited. And that's got to be enough to provide an audit for the whole group in a complex situation. You've got to carry out the energy audits of the identified sites and processes and transport. Then you've got to complete the overall audit, which pulls all that together and which is signed off by the ESOS lead assessor, who must be on the register and also signed off by a participant director. Having done all of that, you have to notify compliance, and that has to be by the compliance date, which is December the 5th, 2019. And then subsequent to that, you have to maintain an evidence pack for possible inspection and audit. Okay, Nose, that's over to you.
Yep. Okay.
Do you want to go on to the next one?
No, just to sum up on
that one.
Yeah, just sum up on that one. I was at an Environment Agency called meeting last week. We were actually meeting to consider changes in standards for people on the registers for Phase 3, 2023. So I thought I'd mention that because it'll probably head off questions about what do we think is happening regarding the future of ESOS. The Environment Agency are currently working on 2023 requirements, but at the meeting they mentioned how they'd been tracking down companies that they thought needed to comply and hadn't, and picking up on what John said about that proving quite difficult in terms of establishing ownership structure and who is participating and so on. That's caused problems for the Environment Agency as well. But as of this point in time, they're down to less than 50 companies that they're still working with to get them compliant, which means that they're quite confident that very shortly they will have, well, they didn't say 100%, they said 99% compliance. And who'd have thought we'd be saying that when this was all kicking off in 2015? So, compliance via the 50001 route. Well, you need to establish a strategy with board level reporting and responsibilities at the outset. Review and engage with a certifying organisation and any other support. I think the certifying organisation primarily to talk about potential timescales, so you know at what point you need to properly engage with them, possibly to get an idea of costing as well. Any other support will depend on the degree of in-house expertise that you you have in your organisation, whether you'll be relying heavily on consultants. So you set up a system for documentation, actions and non-compliances, which is good housekeeping, hold internal and external audits of the energy management system, which is also good housekeeping. Carry out continuing monitoring, reporting and improvement plans, which I would hope most ESOS assessors, in terms of identifying opportunities, would talk to their clients about ongoing monitoring and reporting of the recommended improvements. That in itself is an opportunity to maintain the value of savings. So finally, when you've done all that, you can obtain certification and notify compliance by December the 5th, 2019. If you're going down this route, you do need to maintain certification. There are annual events, surveillance audits, and every third year you need to recertify. But we'll talk about that a bit more when we come on to costings. It doesn't actually list this here, but I think it's quite a good idea to get hold of a copy of 50001. It's not daunting. It's not very complicated. It is most of the things you need to do for ESOS, but just wrapped up in good housekeeping principles. Okay, John, you mentioned earlier.
From the point of view of service providers on ISO 50001, there's a certification audit and the certification itself, and the consultancy support roles. Most organizations can use technical support to help implement a certified ENMS. But organizations new to ISO energy management systems will normally need support for actually setting up and management, unless their internal staff are very capable and well involved. So in terms of the service providers, there's two completely separate areas of service there. So the next issue is what happens about this option. I think the option of combining the two routes provides a lot of flexibility, and it's particularly useful if the ISO route seems attractive, but not for the entire organization, and that would include situations when you have a possible ISO certification, but it may not cover transport, for example, and which is the third bullet, in fact. So that's on the scope, or you don't have time to do the whole organization before the next ESOS compliance deadline, and you can do part of the organization, and that'll reduce the ESOS effort and also help you go towards an eventual ESOS compliance. The steps are as the previous ISO slide, but the part that's covered by the ISO system must be clearly defined, and for the remaining organization, the standard ESOS compliance must be followed, including sign-off by an ESOS lead assessor before notification of compliance.
Okay, thanks, John. So having run through those slides, let's have a look at the actions side by side. There's a lot of information on this slide, but just to quickly go through it, the items in grey are specifically compliance items. The items in black, the actions you would need to be taking. So for ESOS, you'd be looking to appoint a lead assessor. For 50001, you'd probably be looking to talk to a UCAS accredited certification body. You'd probably also, as John has just said, want to engage with someone equivalent to your ESOS lead assessor who would be able to offer advice in setting up the system. In both columns, we've got items on ESOS resolving group ownership. On the right, establishing responsibilities, team, scope and policy. So those are both sort of scoping activities. We're then measuring energy and deciding significant energy use or uses, establishing performance indicators and so on. So on the ESOS side, you're deciding compliance route and audit plan, which could be standard audits or 50001 or both. If you've already decided 50001, you'll be producing your action plan for improvements. So in both columns, we've then got some audit work. On the ESOS side, producing the overall assessment. There's a bit more detail on the 50001 side, and this is what I was saying earlier, is the good housekeeping really. So communicating internally and externally, recording everything, having a system of documentation, the legal compliance checks, the monitoring and targeting, and also internal checking, internal audits to make sure to demonstrate that you're aware of any issues and that you're addressing them. So by the time we get to the bottom of the table, we're converging again. You need director sign off for the ESOS assessment. On the 50001 side, you need senior management review, response and actions. You do actually need director sign off for the 50001 as well. So we're then maintaining certification on the right hand side, and on the left hand side, just making sure you've got your evidence pack together. And in both cases, you notify compliance to the Environment Agency. On the ESOS side, again, good advice from lead assessors would be to start work on the next cycle and not leave it for 3 years and do everything in a dash at the end. We had to do that in 2015 because of the timing of the legislation, but that's not really the intention going forward. So there's quite a lot of information we've covered there. John, what are the time implications of all of this?
Well, just before we go on to that, on the compare actions, on the ISO, I think it's worth stressing for the nth time that the word audit on the ISO generally means an audit of your energy management system. You can see the ENMS-audit, and the stage 1 and stage 2 audits are all audits of your energy management system, whereas the audits on the left-hand side and the ESOS are actual energy audits of your premises, or the group audit of your whole organization. And this does tend to cause confusion, and it's worth just being very clear about that. But we're trying to be clear about it by prefacing it with either energy audit or an energy management system audit. That's one thing I'd say. The other thing is that the ISO route has stages which are highly valuable and often missing from a normal energy management operation. And my experience with energy management over the years is that energy managers and their direct clients are not always the best people in the world at doing this. And these are stages which are missing. And it's the fantastic thing about the ISO, that it actually makes people do things that actually make energy management work. And and that's why the ISO is valuable. It has on costs. It's a bigger exercise, but these can be minimized as part of the compliance plan. And we go into later how the costs of those can be reduced by many factors. So going on to the timelines, which is one of the trickier areas. And so I think that it's worth just spending a few seconds going through what's going on here. Down the left-hand side, we've got the dates, which is, you can say, 2016, December 2016, December 2017, mid-2018, where we are now, although you wouldn't believe it from the weather, and December 28, the 5th of December 2018, then the 31st of December 2018 is the ESOS so-called qualification date for this phase. Then you get 2019, and the 5th of December 2019 is the compliance date. Now you have energy years. This is energy data years, and the first possible one in this phase is the left-hand bordered one. And the energy years must include the qualification date and must end before the compliance date. So the conclusion from that is that that left-hand one is the earliest possible energy data year, which we're in now. We're about a third of the way through it. The latest possible one, which is really pushing your luck because you're ending this the day before your compliance date, would be to start on the 5th of December 2018 and end on the 4th of December 2019. So that is approaching. So the latest possible energy year is approaching fast. I'm going to go now over onto, well, I'll probably go to the compliance. So the compliance must be completed on or before the compliance date. And since it must include the whole energy year, it can't start. You can't do your compliance before the box on the left. So that third pink column is the only time you can do compliance, and it must be finished it must be submitted by the 5th of December 2019. So in terms of the audits, Note 3 gives rather a complicated rule on when the audits must be, which I'm not going to go into, but it is worth reading. It's got to have the audit's got to have 12 months data, and it must start. You know, there's limitations on when it must start and finish, so that's a slightly longer period when the audits must be carried out. But that is actually the longest periods during which you can do the audits. We might come back later to the fact of which audits you can use. You can't use an audit that's already been completed for phase 2, which you did in phase 1. So going on to the ISO deadlines, I'm going to give a quick introduction and ask Andrew to comment on this. But the stage is the key stage is the ISO certification, which must be valid for ESOS on the compliance date. So whatever ISO certification you're using must be valid at that date. So the typical working backwards, you wouldn't expect to be able to go much later than so the next year, middle of next year, for your stage 1 or 2 audits, energy management system audits, and internal energy management system audits a bit earlier than that, and the review of your energy use, which forms the basis of any management system, would have to happen earlier than that. So these deadlines are starting to get pretty squashed, and I'll hand over to Andrew there for any further on that, or the next one.
Yes. Well, the sort of exact timings of the grey bars on this chart for the ISO route are a little bit of a stab in the dark, because it's going to vary depending on what an organisation's resources are like, and whether they're using a lot of external resource. But working backwards from the certification date, an organisation needs to set up a system, possibly from scratch, which there's a lead time involved in that. We recommend that people have been operating the system for at least 6 months before they apply to us for certification, so that all of their internal procedures are not just in documents, they've actually happened. We can deal with the show me questions, which then brings you to our involvement at stage 1 and 2 audits. We ideally plan those to be a month apart, so that any issues, stage 1 is basically a dry run to make sure we're happy you're in a position to proceed to the full certification audit. So that month gives organisations time to address any minor issues that we identify at the stage 1. So there's a 6 month before applying to us, and there's a month between certification audits, and then there's a decision-making process beyond the stage 2. And it's possible, but not to be relied on, that the certification decision would be straightforward and immediate following the stage 2, hence leaving a bit of a gap at the bottom of the final grey box before the compliance date. So I think whichever route you go for, there is a risk of resource issues. Again, reference my meeting last week, we had some data. There were 771 active lead assessors, 270 with CIBSE, but 771 in total. That's not a lot of people when you think of the number of organisations requiring a lead assessor. And if you go down the 50,001 route, we need to apply audit resource to that. Now, something that was said in the meeting last week was, what have these 771 people been doing in the interim period when there haven't been ESOS reports to produce? Well, there've been a few to produce as companies have been chased down, but our lead assessors were all on our low carbon consultants register already, and were working with clients on energy advice, sort of independent of ESOS requirements. So the trouble is, if you leave it to the last minute, you might find that they're still doing that and are not available for ESOS work. So you do need to plan this early. Flip side to that is we only picked up about half of our LCCs who stepped up to the ESOS register. So we could quite easily double the number of active assessors if the demand was there. Of course, the other thing with resources, a lot of those consultants are also doing ISO 50001 implementation work. And some of them are doing audit work. So if they're not doing one, they'll be doing the other, which again puts a risk on the resource. But I'm confident we've got a big enough pool of low carbon consultants to draw on, whether it's the ESOS route or the 50,001 audit route, we'll be able to meet demand. But nevertheless, please don't leave it to the last minute. That could cause us both problems. So having gone through that, I think one of the topics that you're all eagerly awaiting information on is cost comparison. How do we look at the costs of the two different options? Well, the first thing to say is this is very difficult. It does depend on the starting point for either route. How good is your current energy management? Some organisations will be really on top of it. Some won't have thought of it before. It depends on the size and complexity. Depends a lot on reliance on external consultants or whether you have in-house expertise. The EA guidance acknowledges that ISO 50001 goes beyond basic compliance. And benefits beyond compliance are achieved in practice. So there's going to be a cost implication there as well. So that sounds like we're procrastinating and can't really help with cost comparison because it is so variable. But I think there are some elements we could probably pin down a bit better than that. So on the 50,001 side, as I've already said, we are certifying organisations. So we have experience of this. So for the certification element only, for a fairly straightforward organisation, so probably single site, could be multiple facilities on the site, but a single site, between 5 and 10 million energy bill, using 2 or 3 different fuels. The initial certification cost is going to be somewhere between £4,000 and £5,000. The annual surveillance between £1,500 and £2,000, and the 3-yearly recertification about £3,000. So in the bigger scheme of things, that's probably not a big cost factor. The real cost is the cost of implementation, and that is the bit that's difficult. If you're already well organised and have a lot of in-house expertise, there won't be much direct costs. There'll be indirect costs, of course, through salaries, but people will be doing what you're paying them for anyway. So that's the 50,001 side. On the ESOS route, I'm relying more on anecdotal information, sort of feedback from people active on the register, but the costs there are likely to be about between £1,000 and £2,000 for the work that the lead assessor does directly in producing the compliance report. The auditing work then, the energy auditing work, you're probably looking at something around £2,000 per site, and it's the per site that's the big variable there. It depends on the size and complexity of the organisation. So I hope that's a helpful starter on the costing. Is there anything John wants to add on that?
Yeah, I would just say that I think from that it's clear that for smaller organisations, the ISO is likely to be who are fresh to the ISO. It's like the ISO is likely to be the more costly route. We've been stressing that the ISO has benefits, and also that there are opportunities for reducing the cost of the ISO route. And factors that might do that are described in the next slide. And so we've got a couple here on first the ISO, and I'm going to go through these quite quickly because we need to get a move on. But okay, the ISO cost will be reduced if you have or are planning to have ISO 50001 or related ISOs such as environmental management or occupational health and safety or quality management. And increasingly, certainly on corporates, this is the case. And then what with the harmonization of these standards recently, the addition of 50001 can be fairly procedural, and that makes a major difference. And then the next thing is, if you've got individual sites or activities which are sitters for the ISO for some reason, then those can be implemented, and that'll reduce your ESOS effort. If you've got relevant governance policy or are streaking or want to strengthen board engagement, I think, as I've said before, I think the ISO is particularly good at ensuring that you get reporting at board level, responsibility, and action plans which are followed up at board level. Then if you want to, if you're looking to make use of ISO for public relations or group internal recognition purposes, I've seen organizations where they have broadcast environmental or sustainability goals and activities, but their energy management really doesn't seem to match up to it. Well, this would be a very good way of progressing that. And I think Andrew actually brought this last one in. In fact, I'll hand over to. Oh no, yeah, no. I'll carry on actually because we can spend too long otherwise. But if you're operating across the member states, the ISO is pan-Euro. It's across the whole of Europe, with the same ISOs in each country, where in each member state. Whereas the ESOS is a UK scheme. So that's a clear opportunity for synergy there. So going on to the standard audit route, and if you've got audits which you've been doing, which are, and that doesn't normally include, in fact, it doesn't include ones that were completed for the previous phase of ESOS. But if you've got audits that you can use, and frankly, if you've been doing audits and they're not ESOS compatible, and you're going an ESOS route, that's crazy. So you know, if you have audits, then you can use those without further cost, or if you've got audits which fit in with planned works or expansional strategy or anything like that. If you run out of time for ISO 50001, then obviously the standard audit route potentially is quicker. Lastly, the combined route is obviously good for filling in if you can do some or most of the organisation, but not all of it. And at that point, I'll hand over to Andrew again.
Yes, I think I was just saying, sort of summing up on that, there's actually no avoiding ISOs, because if you're not going down the ISO 50001 route and you're conducting standard ESOS audits, they will of course be best done in compliance with ISO 50002 or BSEN 16247. Right, we are almost out of time, so just to sort of head off any potential questions perhaps, and to sum up, we're aware of recent and incoming changes. There's been some conversations about other uses for ESOS, and also the questions about whether ESOS has a future. The meeting I was at last week, there was no suggestion of any material changes for 2019. What's currently published is what's going to happen. Things like the integration with other reporting is still being considered, so that's all possible. We need to watch that space. On the 50,001 side, we are expecting a new issue of 50,001 later in 2018. I think it will be quite late in 2018. There was a big meeting drawing together international committees in Berlin last week. I'm actually getting feedback on that this afternoon. So bad timing in the context of this webinar. But I say that should appear later in the year. I think the important thing to note with the new standard coming in, that does introduce uncertainty, and there have been a few conversations on things like LinkedIn about that. Of course, the transition will not be required before December 2019. So I think all the 50,001 certificates that will be used for 2019 compliance will be issued in conformity with the current 2011 standard. There is a cut down version for SMEs similar to the one that exists for 14,001 being proposed, but that is still in the planning stage. Okay, so that's all I was going to say.
Yeah, just looking at that slide, there's some nasty looking acronyms there. So just taking the middle bullet on ESOS. So that's all about the fact that the CRC scheme is going to end after 2019, and that as you will know, that will lead to an increase in the climate change levy, and the reporting aspects of the CRC will go to the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting almost certainly, and which is the MGHG, and the SECER is the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting Initiative by the Department of Industry BEIS. So that's what those acronyms are, and what BEIS are trying to do is to make it fit in better, and for the whole system to be streamlined more. But as Andrew said, I don't think any of these are affecting this phase of ESOS.
No, that's right. They're all sort of.
So back to you, Andrew.
Okay, thanks, John. Well, hopefully we've given you the information you need to make choices, supported with our views on what the choices are. So it is basically over to you now. The clock is ticking. We've got about 15 minutes now, I think, so we'll have a look at the questions that have been coming in while we've been talking, and see if we can pick off some of those while we're on air. Any that we don't manage to get to, we will deal with by correspondence.
Oh, okay, so at the top. Okay, so.
Yeah, right. Is there a date by which the ISO route to ESOS compliance is too late, too risky? Yes, there probably is. And there is a risk that you go down that route, and as you saw from the timeline that we showed, it's quite a long lead time. The longer the lead time, the more risk of things going wrong along that timeline. I think what I would say to that is, there's equally a risk that you might not get your all your audits done in time for your ESOS reporting. So there are risks on both sides. With the ISO route, once you're engaged with us and we've got dates in diaries and we think it's reasonable in terms of your ESOS compliance, we would anticipate that organisations would let us know that was their objective, the 2019 reporting. If we got to the stage 1 audit point and found there was rather a lot still to be done, I think at that point we'd be suggesting they appoint a lead assessor, an ESOS lead assessor, and asking them to look at what they've done for their 50,001, bearing in mind that 50,001 is widely acknowledged as going beyond the ESOS compliance requirements. So it would be quite likely to be a quick and straightforward thing for a lead assessor to pull out of the 50,001 project what they needed for ESOS compliance. There's still plenty of time between stage 1 and stage 2. As you might remember from that program, the month between the stages, the actual stage 2 audit, and then a period for any remedial measures after stage 2. So I think as long as we knew what your aims were, we could flag up at the end of stage 1 whether we thought you were still realistically on course for achieving that deadline, or whether you ought to go to plan B. The work won't have been wasted, because it will make plan B pretty straightforward, and of course you're still in a very good place for continuing to complete your certification and have it ready for the 2023 reporting and all the benefits in between.
Well, the next one is, has 50,001 been popular with single site easy energy audits as an easy ESOS replacement rather than large organizations? And my top of the head response to that would probably be no. I don't think that's been its market so far. I think it's been with larger organizations that are more energy aware. Not begging the question of whether it should have been, I think the answer is to date it probably hasn't been. We tried to address today that it's suitable for a wider audience, but I think the straight answer to that would probably be to date no.
Either no or we don't know. Say there's 3,000 certificates been issued. We don't know what the driver for most of those was. That's just a bare statistic that's been reported. We don't know what the 2017 figures were, whether that has been climbing, that you know, whether that trend has continued. We are certainly being asked by a lot of people about 50,001 for ESOS compliance as we've moved into 2018. There's been more inquiries about that this year than there were last year.
There's a few there. I can't. We've got so many. I'm tempted to go for interesting ones, and the one that interests me there, is it necessary to obtain ISO 50001 certification? Do you have to be able to demonstrate actual savings in consumption? I'm sure that Andrew will be dying to answer that one. I mean, I could have a go, but you know a lot about that. It's a very, very interesting question.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of concern over the 2018 edition of 50,001 in this context. That might be what's driving that question.
But Andrew, come on. Yes or no?
Well,
the answer is no. You don't actually have to show a saving in consumption.
You don't. I'm going to start by quoting an ISO publication, which says, "It is important to recognise that management system standards define requirements for an organisation's management system and not the specific performance criteria that are to be achieved." So whilst energy savings would be part of the energy management system through plans and identifying opportunities and monitoring and targeting, the decision to issue a certificate or not is based on how effective the management system is and how able it is to achieve actual savings, rather than to be able to demonstrate actual savings at a point in time, which I think is behind the question. The phrase that's used in the standard is continual improvements, not continuous. Continuous is unbroken. Continual can be broken. So at a particular point in time, you may not be able to demonstrate actual savings in consumption, but that is not the basis of the certification decision. And one way of looking at this, we had a webinar a while ago. Some of you may have sat in on the 50,006, which gives advice on baselining and energy performance indicators, and mentions several techniques for doing this. If you're going to take the time and trouble to do this properly, you ought to have an idea of what your energy consumption would have been had you not had an energy management system in place. In other words, having an inflationary factor on your baseline, because you may be in a situation where your actual consumption has gone up, but it is still less than it would have been had you not been managing your energy. So I hope that answers that question. I'm sure there'll be others with similar questions.
Can I have a go at that one? Because that comes up time and time again. somebody's asked, if you have completed an ESOS assessment for phase 1, do you need to repeat the building surveys for phase 2? And my clear understanding of that is, if you've got only a certain number of buildings, you haven't done sampling, then you've got to repeat. Then you've got to repeat the surveys. You can't use the phase 1 surveys, audits. If you've got a sampling arrangement in phase 1, in principle, you could. You certainly can't reuse the surveys. You could probably get away with resurveying some of the buildings, but I think it wouldn't be, it wouldn't stand up as a very good sample if you just repeated the same buildings that you surveyed in phase 1. So the general answer to that is yes. Sorry, do you need to repeat? Well, you do need to repeat building surveys, but you can't use the same ones unless those are your only buildings.
Yep.
It's interesting.
Someone's asked whether you can streamline ISO 50001 with some of the processes needed for ISO 14001. Yes, the guiding principle now with all of these standards, we mentioned quality as well and occupational health and safety, is that they are the processes are common. So when you're producing a documentation system, you don't need separate systems for each standard. You have an integrated management system. So when there's a requirement to have a particular statement or an internal auditing process or whatever it is, you subdivide then for the different standards you're working with, but the framework is common to all of them. The 2018 50001, when it does appear, will have the same paragraph numbering as 14 and 9. So that makes your whole documentation system much easier.
There's quite a straightforward question here in a way, which is, as ISO 50001 concentrates so much on the energy management system, is there not a risk that audits may miss more tangible opportunities like substandard pipe insulation? In other words, the simple quick hits. And I think that's a really good question as well. And I think the answer to that is that the ISO, where the first thing you do is to do an energy review. And one of the first things you do as part of that energy review is look at your best energy saving opportunities. So you really should be able, it should point up your best opportunities for energy saving. So I think the answer to that is that it might miss it, but it shouldn't. And also that the ISO is quite concise. It's not a very bulky. It's not a very bulky requirement. So it should actually nail the obvious opportunities.
Yes, and if I could add to that, John, when I've been conducting audits of organisations' energy management systems, although as the question suggests, there's a focus on the operation of the system, in doing that, we're expecting to see internal reviews of that energy review. And what I see in practice when I'm looking at organisations who are certified is that they are doing mini ESOS assessments, if you like, on a regular basis and reporting back and reviewing, and you know, what's worked they do more of and what hasn't worked they do less of. So it is very similar to the ESOS process. The same work is being done on the ground. It's just being coordinated and maintained. I think John and I have both been in this industry a long time, and yeah, we've seen it so often that there's a immediate reason for paying attention to energy efficiency, whether it's supply problems or more recently climate change or cost. But these bursts of attention tend to be short-lived. Embedding it in a management system just means that the organisation don't lose sight of the need to keep on top of their energy costs.
I think, Andrew, as somebody who's been heavily involved in this, you'd be a good one to answer that, which confused me in the, when I set out on ISO work. But, what is the difference between a stage 1 and stage 2 external audit?
Yeah, okay. I think I may have skipped skipped over this a bit earlier on when I mentioned it. I don't really want to use the phrase pre-audit because it's not that's not a phrase used in the standard, but the breaking the audit process into 2 stages gives us an opportunity to have a look at the whole management system at a fairly high level, and make that judgment at the end of stage 1. Stage 1, in the example I was quoting earlier for a fairly straightforward situation, is a 1-day audit. So we would go in for 1 day, and at the end of that 1 day, be able to form a view on how ready the organisation was, give them some feedback if there's a few things still need doing, and then come back, say, typically a month later to do the full audit, which would be 2 or 3 days in order to make the certification decision. So it is a filter, a pre-assessment, if you like, to make sure everything's on track. If you sort of back to back the stage 1 and stage 2 and get that all in your diary for 3 or 4 consecutive days, and there's a problem at the end of day 1, you've then got the problem of reorganising everyone's diaries. So it is just that reassurance before committing to the longer stage 2 audit. I'm afraid I think we have run out of time. So if we haven't answered your question, please submit it in the further comments section in the post-webinar survey. You will have access to this after leaving the webinar. A copy of the presentation will be emailed out to you later today. So thank you all very much for listening. I hope that's been helpful. Please do ask any further questions that we haven't answered.